Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning for this week's Come Follow Me lesson with the Mormon News Report podcast. My name is Jenny Noonan Dye. I am joining you from Provo, Utah, along with my husband, John Dye. He's the one who's responsible for all that you see on your screen for those of you who are watching the video with us. As always, for those of you who are participating in real time here on the video stream, we would love to hear from you, where you are, what stood out to you in your study this week, whether it's the first time or the 50th time you've read these verses, or even, yes, if you didn't read them at all. We get to as many comments as we can, just as we would if we were gathered all together in person. We'd like to try to use this space and time as a supplement to your other Come Follow Me studies, to sometimes take a deeper dive into at least one aspect of the lesson that stands out. We love having your participation and your feedback. I'd like to excuse my co-host for the Mormon News Report podcast, Brant Malone. He's in Detroit. He's tending to some family responsibilities. And welcome, as always, let's face it, he's our Sunday school teacher. All the way from California, it's Ben Bernards. Good morning, Ben.
Good morning, Jenny. Welcome, everybody, to the Mormon News Report Hour of Power. Everybody in here, out there, we are so glad you're with us as we dive again into our AP Church history, hoping to supplement your Sunday school like the extra sauce on the baby back ribs we're doing for the cookout tomorrow. Happy Memorial Day. Hope you guys have good weather. John and Jenny, you guys have any plans? Anything big going on?
No, I don't think so. The kids are now officially on their summer break, and so yesterday, John arranged for a nice guy to come over and basically do bicycle tune-ups for all the bikes, and so we're gonna, encouraging that sort of thing. And
yep, we'll get out and enjoy the weather. And 8 letters, yard work. 8 letters, 2 words, right? So maybe some of that. We've got some celestial rock, some crushed marble we're placing in the parking strip. So that'll probably happen. Some of that tomorrow.
That sounds great.
What about you, Ben? Do you have plans?
Well, my boys are really looking forward to spending the whole day sitting in front of a computer screen and staring into the camera. This time playing video games instead of Zoom, because apparently they just could not get enough of it for the past 15 months, however long we've been doing this. And we had plans to go down to a park with our friends in our little pod and just do dinner and chillax. But the weather decided it was going to be 108 degrees tomorrow. What? So we might be inside with the air conditioning instead.
No kidding. That might be maybe a picnic breakfast and then inside the afternoon or something. Oh my goodness. Wow. Yeah. Well, already some friends are making themselves known. So good morning to, is it Saini Kafusi in San Francisco, to Steve in San Diego, and to Kalani in the Glendale area of Salt Lake. This week's lesson is called Anxiously Engaged in a Good Cause, something that we hear quite often throughout our lives. It covers just 2 sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, sections 58 and 59. So, yeah, without further ado, I guess, Ben.
Yeah, anxiously engaged in a good cause. A couple of years ago, I was a teacher at EFY, and this was our theme, our theme scripture for the week: anxiously engaged, anxiously engaged. And it was the kind of thing where if you say that phrase over and over and over again, it becomes, your brain gets flooded with it and it starts to lose meaning. It's the thing that there's a term for it. It's called semantic satiation, where you start to disassociate the meaning from the words and it just becomes a meaningless sound. And all of a sudden, by the end of the week, I was like, guys, we have to talk about this somehow totally differently, because just telling the kids to go be anxiously engaged is causing anxiety. And that is not what we want to have happen here. So hopefully we're going to approach this from a slightly different angle. And again, like all good things in church history or in the Doctrine and Covenants, there is a section that is purely historical. And as you read through these sections, you'll see that there is a little bit of like busy work, right? There's stuff that says, hey, you got to go here, you got to go there. But of course, through that gravel, we get to mine for the gems. And that's what we're looking for today, especially as this starts to introduce the concept of building Zion. And calling the people to a central place. Now, for us, we're not being called to build Zion in the same way that they were. So how does this apply to us? Like, what does building Zion look like for us? I mean, they thought that Zion as a city and Christ's return to help kind of, cut the banner to the city were both proximate and inevitable. Like, they both thought they were just about to happen. And both of them failed to occur within that lifetime. So what does that mean for us? And how do we deal with this sense of gospel disappointment when things don't turn out the way that we thought they would in a healthy, constructive way? Those are some of the things that we want to talk about today. So first off, let's kind of set the scene and set the stage of the historical aspect of where we're at. Okay, so we're looking at the 1800s. We've got a visual up here, and again, we'll put all these slides up. The United States was still just those 13 nifty original colonies, right? And they had just a couple of other states that have been added to the West, Ohio and Kentucky, and France was still here. They still owned a whole lot of territory. Spain was somewhere further out west. And most of the folks that were living here in America were all within a 1 or 2 days, several days wagon trip with each other, but everybody is kind of crammed up on the East Coast. And spreading west was this gradual thing that happened, but everybody knew that that was undeveloped land. It was wild. There was lots of Native Americans out there. That was not where most of the people had been gathering. And of course, that is exactly where God said, you're going to go. Now, one thing that I really appreciated about this lesson in the updated gospel library was links to 2 additional articles called The Revelations in Context that I thought were wonderfully instructive. Now, we're not going to go over most of them, but this whole idea of where these people were in the city, go ahead and go to the next one, John, if you would, please. Eventually, we're going to end up in the city called Independence, and here's an artist representation of what it looked like kind of at its peak. It became this trailhead of multiple different routes. You could go southwest to Santa Fe. You could go straight west and then cut north to Oregon. You go a little bit further west and then go south along the Mississippi. So Independence as the general area became, after a while, quite the hub to many different travel spokes. But this is not what it looked like when the early Mormon saints got there. When they got there, it was just open fields and dirt and shacks and a lot of ruffians and no law and no order and no help. So with that, John, if you would go to the next one, please. There is, as you go looking through the gospel library, especially as you read section 58, you'll see a little icon and there's links to 2 different articles on the right. One called The Center Place from Revelations in Context. And that one just talks about the whole general place setting and you can see where we fit into the whole puzzle. The second one it recounts 2 specific stories of people that are there, Ezra Booth and Isaac Morley. So to help lay out this historical context, I'd like to share 2 little snippets from the first essay, The Center Place. Jen, if I could actually have you read these. John, go ahead and go to the next one, please.
Sure.
So this is from the Center Place article. Jen, go ahead.
Excuse me. At the time when Indian removal, the separation of one race from another, had become a national policy of the U.S. government, Joseph Smith's revelations moved in another direction. Rather than marginalizing Indians, and I just want to make sure American Indians here, so that
American Indians, yeah.
Native Americans, pushing them to the outskirts of civilization, the revelations brought Zion to them, putting God's holy city in their midst. Zion was to be found between Jew and Gentile, between the races. In this arrangement, people of multiple races could play an essential role in God's work. People on every compass point of the center, if they were willing, could become the pure in heart and dwell in Zion in safety and peace.
Good stuff. Okay, let's go ahead and go one more.
Okay.
Next slide. There we go.
Instead, the revelation spoke of the inhabitants of the earth, putting all of God's children together. Zion, the revelation explained, was a place where all nations shall be invited. The word nations would have resonated with readers in the 1830s, for it was the word both Native Americans and whites used to describe the largest unit of their political organization. The revelation went on to speak of Zion, including the rich and the learned, the wise and the noble, people with political and social power. But it was also to include people who had traditionally lacked such power, those who had been traditionally forgotten and marginalized, the poor, the lame, the blind, and the deaf. Ultimately, all of God's children were to have a seat at the same table. Bound in covenant relation, all were to share in God's sacred space.
Oof, good stuff. Jen, before I go any further, any thoughts on what you read? Anything stick out to you? This description of what Zion could possibly look like?
Well, I think it's interesting because, as we study our church history here in the Doctrine and Covenants, and as we proceed along in our own, even just existence as hoping to be Latter-day Saints, it is not uncommon for us to have the idea that Zion is a physical place. And in fact, we see that often throughout. That's a huge part of what we're studying this week, right? Is the idea that they're told to establish Zion, and they say, oh, well, Zion must be this place. It must be this place. It must be this place. When in fact, it isn't or doesn't need to be a physical place at all, but can be a belonging that extends beyond the bounds of a physical point. I mean, I know, Ben, we've talked before about how you grew up in Utah, pretty much right in between Salt Lake City and Provo. And so you would have a different perspective on this than I, but it was a reality for me growing up elsewhere. I grew up in New York, that Utah was looked at and as a superior location, like a physically superior location. And this was not that long ago. And I don't know if I hope people don't still feel that way, because it is not physically possible for everyone to physically gather in, that physical place, at least comfortably and appropriately.
There's only so much construction that can happen on the I-15 corridor over Point of the Mountain. And Saratoga Springs is nice, right? The west side of Utah Lake is okay. South side of Utah Lake, nobody lives there. But, up along the Wasatch Front, it's okay, but it's getting a little crowded.
Please don't put that out there as a dare that there could not be more construction, because that they will. But if you say it, they'll do it.
It's going to happen.
But I think that is an important thing to remember. That it's almost been as if our own human understanding is lacking. That we don't understand all things. That the idea of building Zion, of going to Zion, of coming to Zion, is something beyond moving physically, which, let's be honest, I don't say that to dismiss what the early saints not only endured, but willingly sacrificed and did. At the same time, there's more to it than establishing a new city of residence.
Ooh, I love that. There's more to it than just the city and just establishing the city. And I think this is a beautiful, I don't want to call it a contradiction, but it's the paradox that God simultaneously told them, get here and get to the city, because this is going to be the place. And then when they got there, spoiler alert, and the city was never built and they got ran out, and they turned around and they looked at God like, what the heck, man? This didn't happen. And then for him to say, actually, it's more than that. So, I remember when I was a teenager learning about the Mormon concept of heaven and hell. And as a little kid, we see the stereotypical tropes of hell being lava and fire and pitchforks, and heaven being clouds and robes and harps. And at some point, and we just kind of go with that, right? And then at some point we realize, as you're studying LDS theology, that we have things called spirit world and spirit prison and paradise. And the closest thing that we see to hell, that Alma the Younger describes when he has his, 3 days of being, touched by an angel, and he's like totally knocked on his back and things are miserable. He describes hell as the terror of being brought to God with a full remembrance of everything that he had done wrong, and now he has to account for it. And he says, I wish that I could have shrunk, body and soul away from that. I wanted to be anywhere but there. That was hell. And so in that sense, we realize that it very much is a state of mind, that where our souls land in the next life, maybe everybody is going to be there physically proximate, like right next to each other. But inside, it could be totally night and day different because of where they were. And it seems like this is one of the lessons that we're trying to learn about building Zion, is that, yes, there is an argument to be made about getting people together. I mean, we've kind of learned that over the past 14 years, that we need human connections, and it feels good to gather. But if we can't be there, then how can we build that same mentality and that same connection inside? I mean, look at how many different people we've got chiming in from all around the world, listening in, both live and afterwards. This is fabulous.
Yeah. Speaking of which, we've got Adele in Utah, Celeste in Anaheim, Mary in San Antonio. It's a boy. San Antonio is a boy. Sheila in the Philippines. Also, Beth in the Philippines. Nelda in Toronto. Hello, Steve, Nancy in West Jordan, of course, and Mary in Syracuse. Laurel shares quite adeptly here. I believe that Zion is an experience, separate from the world's experience right before Jesus comes back.
That's really good stuff. Thank you, Laurel. Now, there's a particular verse in D&C 58 that I want to focus in on that kind of continues this whole idea about Zion being something different. This is in section 58, verses 2 through 4. Jen, could I read you to ask that for us, please?
Yes. For verily I say unto you, blessed is he that keepeth my commandments, whether in life or in death. And he that is faithful in tribulation, the reward of the same is greater in the kingdom of heaven. Ye cannot behold with your natural eyes for the present time the design of your God concerning those things which shall come hereafter, and the glory which shall follow after much tribulation. For after much tribulation come the blessings. Wherefore the day cometh that ye shall be crowned with much glory. The hour is not yet, but is nigh at hand.
Okay. There's a lot to unpack there. That is one of the gems that I absolutely love. And to help us do that, I want to share 3 different stories, and let's see if you can see the common threads between all of these. Story number 1, we've got a young kid out at college, and they are finishing up their first year. They're doing general eds, but they know that they need to choose a major within the next year or 2, and they're worried that the high-paying careers that parents are really encouraging them to go for will come at the cost of living with a soul-sucking, boring desk job and really hard classes. And they haven't tried them yet, but they wish that the fun, easy classes that they're in now could somehow bring the financial stability that they want to get on the other side. And they're really like, I don't want to go do the hard thing. I want to stay with the easy thing. So, story number 1. Story number 2, another teenage kid, this one at home, that is being frustrated by their parents' restrictions on internet usage, especially the fact that it cuts off at a certain time every night. And the kid says, man, I really wish that you would give me more freedom to stay online, like just totally take it off completely. I mean, it's not like anything's going to go wrong. Why do you even need to have this there? So story number 2. Story number 3, I saw on a run last week, there was this, we live kind of close to a river out here in Sacramento, and there's lots of wetlands that extend by the river. And so because of that, there's this levee that's like this raised mound that's 30 to 40 yards wide that kind of winds along, and there's a trail on top of it. And that goes through our neighborhood. And so there is a pond down set in the middle that's federally protected wetland area. So there's this huge fence around it. So humans can't go down there. So wildlife just absolutely love the pond in the middle of this wetland area. And this is the time of year when Canada geese are out there with all their little goslings. And if anybody has gone on a run with Canada geese and goslings, you know that those suckers will chase you down and mess you up if you get anywhere close to their babies. So that's what was happening. In the middle of my run, I saw the Canada geese, and I had to like carve a wide berth around them. and they were trying to get into the pond, and they were sitting there looking through the fence, and they could see the water, but they couldn't figure out how to get there. And so for me, up on the levee further away, I could easily see just 20 feet to the right was a hole underneath the fence. And that's where some of the babies had already discovered. But from where the goose was sitting there, standing straight at the fence, just kind of looking back and forth, trying to get in, all they saw was the fence, the water, and the grasses on the side. And I'm sitting up there on the back going, just scoot over, like just go a little bit further. You're going to get it. Just go under there and you'll be perfectly fine. But I knew that if I got anywhere close to that geese, they would turn around and chase me down, and it would get even worse. So all I could do was sit back and let them struggle with it and hope that eventually they would find their way to get to where they needed to go. Okay, so with those three stories, kid at college, kid at home with internet, and the goose trying to get into the water, what do those have in common? And what do they have to do with this verse about us not being able to see with our natural eyes? What do you think, Jen?
To me, it's about the difference in perspectives that we have throughout our lives, whether actual physical perspective like you had, as opposed to the the geese. Because let's be honest, what is that Canadian goose doing? The reason why you didn't approach to try to help was not because that animal is inherently wanting to hurt you. It's because that animal is inherently wanting to protect their own. That's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing at all. In fact, it's a great thing. So yeah, whether the physical perspective that you had from just a different, it was actual higher ground, but it's a different vantage point. Or the perspective of understanding, of life experience, of time, of, okay, I get that you're not excited about these classes, but if you're going to be successful, it's 4 months of something that not only, might be useful to you, but you might be surprised that you actually do enjoy it. Like that might be the best gift of all, right? That you decide that you find that you're like, oh, I thought this was going to be lame. It is not. Or the experience of time and perspective of, oh, kiddo. Okay, no. First of all, that's not what freedom is. Secondly, you need sleep. So that's why the internet shuts off at that hour.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's this whole idea of, I like how God calls out and he says, you can't behold with your natural eyes for the present time, the design of your God. I see so much of heavenly parents in this, where they seem to be reaching out with language that is loving and comforting and not condescending, but helping us realize the fact that we don't see things the same way. And I like how he says, for the present time, like, okay, I know that you can't see for now, but the implication is that eventually you might. And also you can't see with your natural eyes. So let's talk a little bit about what does that mean? Natural eyes. I was kind of chewing this over the other night, thinking about, okay, so how is that related to other scriptures? The first thing that comes to mind is Mosiah 3:19, how the natural man is an enemy to God, right? And frequently in latter-day theology, we set at odds with each other the idea of naturality versus spirituality, where naturality is everything that is carnal and that is physical. And we're not saying bad or good. We're just saying that everything that has to do with this temporal world, right? And the spirituality is the opposite of that. It's everything that has to do with the invisible world. It's everything that deals with God. And in the sense that if the natural man is the enemy to God, that's like in the sense that they're on opposite sides of a chessboard, right? Where they're going contrary directions, and they're going two different to two different goals and two different end states. Whereas if they were allies, they would both be on the same side of the board and they're both going towards the same direction. So in this case, when he says you can't see with your natural eyes, kind of four different things came to my mind. John, if you would pull up the next one, please. I thought about four different ways to kind of see, compare and contrast. Regarding the scope of what we see. I think the natural man is very nearsighted, right? They consider things that are close to them, things that don't even, and the natural man doesn't even have to be moving. They could be stuck in place. They could be just standing right where they are, looking straight down around the things that are within arm's reach. And if they can see something immediately around them, then that's great. And if you can't see or can't reach it, then it's outside your field of vision, right? Which to a certain degree means that they have a lack of imagination about the things that are far away or the things that are unseen. Whereas the spiritual eyes would look to the horizon. They would look to things that are distant. They look to things that are both here and now, but also what is next and what is far, because that's the direction they're going, right? It's this whole idea of, it's not just where am I right now, but where do I want to get to and what's going to be between here and there. Regarding the gains that we have to get, and I'm not talking Brant's physical gains from pumping up from the next WrestleMania thing that he's going to, or lifting in the gym, but the benefits that we receive. I think the natural eyes will focus on what they can get immediately, as quickly as possible. From that perspective, life is a zero-sum game, where there is one winner and everybody else is a loser. That there is one big pie and your goal is to get as big of a slice of it as possible, or else you're going to go hungry, because you know that everybody else is also trying to get as much of the pie as possible. And that also means that if you can't get it right now, if you can't have it immediately, well, then it's not worth getting, because then you'll just turn around and go find something else that you want to get right now. Whereas the spiritual eyes are the opposite of that. The spiritual eyes looks for gains that are like long-term investments. They know that planting seeds today will mean inevitably a lot of invisible magic happening in the darkness underground, and that much of the planter's job is to both water and to wait, to weed and to wait. And eventually you have faith that the fruit will appear, even though you don't know when it's going to happen. But that spiritual perspective will make investments today that will yield dividends in the future. And they say, you know what? Future me is going to thank present me for doing this right now. I'm going to plant a tree under which some future person will rest, because that's where my focus is. And I'm willing to wait for those gains. They're willing to wait for it. Mm-hmm. Regarding struggles, I think the natural man will try to eliminate the pain. They try to minimize it. They will try to avoid the hard feelings and get out of the hard stuff. They have a very low tolerance for discomfort and ambiguity. And if they're dealing with situations where something hurts, if it's bad, the feelings, then they will try to run away or avoid or evade or distract or deny or deflect or do anything they can to minimize and get rid of that pain, because pain is bad. I think the spiritual eyes, on the other hand, know that hurting leads to helping, and that grief leads to growth, and that the burning fires that hurt are at the same time a type of refining crucible, right? And that by acknowledging the discomfort that we go through, and by sitting in the strife, and by being present in the pain, that eventually it passes through us and we pass through it. And when we come out on the other side, we are something totally different. And so in that case, pain is not something to be avoided, but pain is to be endured, because we become a better person because of it. And then the final thing is regarding connections. I think the natural man views just themselves. They don't need others. Their choices don't affect others. It's just their own solitary self, which allows them to maximize personal gain over all others. And anything or anyone that is taking away from yourself is to be avoided. Because if life is truly that zero-sum game, that means then you have this assumption that everybody else is also in it for themselves. And with this kind of solitary cynicism, they think that everybody's just on their own, and that's the way that the game is played. And therefore, there's nothing wrong with that, because you got to look out for number one. But the spiritual side will look at this and say, no, we are interconnected. We are part of an interdependent society, that my life may feel as flimsy and transient as a thread, but it is one thread of millions of others in a beautiful tapestry of humanity. And without it, If my thread were not there, that tapestry would be lacking. And my entire life and all of my choices are completely interwoven with others, and that when I help one or help others, it will always come back to affect me. You know, I heard one pastor in a marching band clinic actually say, in this idea, this is what Jesus was trying to teach when he was on the cross, and he prayed out, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Because when the Jews condemned him to die, and when the Romans pierced his side, they were only killing themselves. So, some thoughts versus natural versus spiritualized. Before I go any further, Jenny, any comments, any thoughts? What's kind of your reaction to this? Does it make sense?
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you kind of broke it down into those categories so that it wasn't just a broad, sweeping, like a generalization. I agree. My immediate thought is exactly what Celeste commented, which is eternal perspective. And of course we could dive a little deeper and kind of break it apart about well, why would I give to society and sacrifice myself? And that's not the point. I mean, we all know that stronger individuals make for a stronger group, but when you have a perspective of the bigger group, basically the bigger picture, then that's when you realize that it can and ought to be both.
It can and it ought to be both. I love how you said that, how the stronger individuals make the stronger group. And there's that self-reinforcing cycle of, let me do what I need to take care of myself, because I know that it also helps other people. Mm-hmm. And let me do what I can to help other people, because I know that it also helps myself.
Exactly.
Right? That's the click. That's Zion. That's what we're looking for. And that's what God is saying, hey, this is what you need to get to.
Yeah.
Okay. So in that same verse, thank you so much. That was, I hope that was helpful. In that same verse, I love how he says, you cannot see with your natural eyes the designs of God, the designs of your God concerning those things which shall come hereafter. I love how it's like he's saying, guys, there's a blueprint here that you don't see. And so when I'm telling you to haul these bags of rocks and go over there to your driveway and put these rocks in this one particular corner of the driveway, you may be saying, this bag is heavy, I'm getting blisters on my hands, it's hot and sweaty, and I want to go play Nintendo and do all these other things. Why do I have to do that? And God is like, well, I've got this perspective of how I want it to look. And I could sit here and try to explain to you how the whole thing is supposed to look. Or you can just trust me. And eventually, as you gain more trust, our perspective will join his and we'll see more of the big picture. And eventually we'll have that moment where it's like, oh my gosh, okay, I think I'm starting to get it now. But along with that, he also says there is glory to come after much tribulation. And he doesn't just say a little bit. It's like he's giving us a forewarning of problems that are coming. He's like, you guys, there's going to be much tribulation coming up after this. So let's talk a little bit about tribulation, because the saints, they got there and boy, it did not work out, right? So spoiler alert, Zion didn't happen. Missouri was a mess. There's going to be several other sections coming forward where we talk about that. And it was an absolutely tragic chapter in our lives. And a lot of people were very disappointed that it didn't happen the way that they thought it was going to be. They thought that Christ was going to come and then all of a sudden things would be better. So let's zoom out from that and take a look at ourselves and find our place in this gospel story and talk a little bit about how does disappointment help us and how do we deal with it. So we'll lead off with a question for Jen and for John and for anybody else that was out here on the stream or in the chat. When was the last time that you were seriously disappointed? Can you think of a time in your life when that's happened?
Yeah.
Do you have anything you'd be willing to share?
Just that it was recent. It's kind of hard to overcome and filter through those things, but I know that there were also other times in my life when I felt seriously disappointed, and with the passing of time and the gaining of more knowledge and experience, thinking about that instance now doesn't seem so dire. Sorry. But at the time, it doesn't lessen the reality that at the time the disappointment was great.
Yeah. And that's kind of an understatement when you say the disappointment was great, right? And when we say, seriously disappointed, I think this is something that we have to give space for and reverence towards for these times in our life. And when I say disappointed in this context, I'm not talking about like you spent the $2 extra for guacamole from your Chipotle bowl and they didn't put the guac in there. I mean, that's an easy disappointment. It is great, and that is a big deal.
That's a bummer. That's not a serious disappointment.
Yeah.
Were you going to say? I think John was going to say one.
Yeah, I've got a few thoughts. One, you can be disappointed in others, right? Because your expectations for what they are or what they will do is different. You can be disappointed in yourself, right? What you're doing is not up to par or where you want to be. Also situations, and that's what we're seeing here, right? In their mind's eye, they had the fact that Zion was a certain way, was a certain thing. Again, we're talking about a destination point, right? Something geographical even. And if you think about Christ, when he came in, right, on Palm Sunday, and he came to a fork in the road, and oh my gosh, he didn't go to the head of government. He went the other direction. And everybody who was waving palms and shouting Hosanna, all of a sudden the crowd dispersed. And it's like, oh, it's the sad trombone emoji. So I think a lot of times we set ourselves up for expectations, thinking that I remember the first time I went to the temple, I fully expected a totally different experience toward the end than I got. It was highly symbolic, as we all know, and I was slightly disappointed. I mean, a lot of people get disappointed. They get mission calls that are in the 48 contiguous states.
And stateside. Oh.
Exactly, right? So I think a lot of this is our own doing.
Absolutely. It's our own doing. And because naturally we have these expectations of how things are going to turn out, right? I saw somebody that shared this idea of, they call it the algebra of happiness, where if we were to take a look at, John, go ahead and go to the next one. You take a look at our expectations minus reality will give us a difference, right? And if that difference is greater than 0, because the reality was bigger than the expectations, then that's happiness, right? But if the difference between those is less than 0, then that is disappointment. And that only happens when two things occur. A, the expectation was seriously bigger than the reality, or B, that reality was so far below even what the baseline expectation could have been. So if you're looking at this, and if you want to maximize happiness, how can you manipulate this equation to guarantee that the resulting difference will always be positive, that it will always be greater than 0?
It's about managing your expectations, being open to that, okay, you might have an opinion, you might have a preference, but to make all of those things, everything that you prefer, everything that you like, that you want to be the expectation for everyone around you, every situation that you find yourself in. I'm looking at you, traffic. That you are going to find that you are disappointed more often than not. We have to allow for the idea that other people have their own expectations and other people have their own realities as well. And that we are not an island, that we do interact with, support, rely on, and in fact need one another. So when we expand what the expectations can be, then we will, I think, find ourselves better off.
I mean, if you ever want to see this, a representation of this perpetual angst of the world around us, of this sense of disappointment and disillusionment, do a Google search, pick your social media platform, and just look up expectations versus reality. And whether it's the Instagram version or the Facebook version or the Twitter version or whatever, pick anything you want, and you will see this contraposition of here's what I thought I was going to get, and here's what it turned out to be instead. And like you said, if the gap between those two things, what I expect versus what is real, the bigger that gap, the greater the disappointment. And so all I can do is either try to improve my reality or lower my expectations. And I remember, talking with one of my kids that's gone off to college, when they were feeling this same sense of it's not turning out the way that I thought. And I said, it sounds really cynical for me to say, but you just got to lower your expectations, sweetheart. And she was like, what? That's horrible. And I'm like, no. I mean that in the best possible way. That when you go in, yes, it is okay to want good things to happen. It's okay to be optimistic. There's nothing wrong with wanting the best possible scenario. However, you also run the risk of setting yourself up for significant disappointment if and when reality strikes, because the reality is something that we don't have as much control over, but we do have full control over our expectations. So in the gospel sense, when we're talking about, like John was saying, going through the temple, here is part of the challenge that I think we have with a system of faith that prescribes a straight and narrow path. A system of faith or a cultural tradition that says, here is the pattern to follow. Here is the A, here is the Z. Everything in between has been laid out for you. And here are the primary classes you move through. And then here's how you're going to get to the tree of life. And you can set up this plan, and it will be a straight line, and it will be a flat, easy path. And then you realize that when the reality sets in of you trying to hit your goal, that all of a sudden you've got pitfalls and the view is no longer there because there's forests in the way. And sometimes instead of getting to the end flag, you realize there's lots of individual checkpoints, and maybe you have to completely ditch the bike and use a totally alternative method of transportation. And maybe you have to kind of stop and wait for a while. And it's not just a flat, easy thing, but there's going to be lots of horrible weather. And sometimes you're going to fall in absolute pits of despair. And sometimes you're going to be stuck with people around you that are also going through the same thing. And you're wondering like, that didn't go according to plan. And from our perspective, if all we saw was that simple flat path getting us to the end, if that was our only perspective, that was our natural eyes, then we could be incredibly frustrated. But that zoomed out perspective is so helpful if we can somehow see that from God's vantage point. Years ago, in the before times, I was running obstacle course races. So if you're familiar with these are kind of cross-country trail races, anywhere from, I want to say like 8 to 15 miles. They usually have a lot of obstacles in them. Some of them are natural obstacles, like running up the side of a ski resort slope, climbing fences, crawling through mud, electroshock therapy, the whole 9 yards. And at the very beginning of it, leading up to it,
because it's the same thing. Just kidding.
Yeah, doing burpees and all that kind of nasty stuff. And it's incredibly painful and it's incredibly difficult. And the reward that you usually get was, psychological, the whole sense of accomplishment, the saying, yeah, I did it. There's a physical benefit of saying I did something that was really hard. For me, this was kind of like the beginning of me trying to get into a new chapter of health and fitness in my life. And I wanted something that could I wanted to accomplish something. And that's what I was going for. And I studied the map because they give you a course map ahead of time. And they tell you from the very beginning, they tell you how long it's going to be. They tell you the elevation. They tell you every single obstacle, and they have them numbered. And then there's close-up photos, and you can see what they're going to look like. There are videos online of other people doing those same obstacles. So basically the idea is when you get there, there are no surprises. Everybody knows ahead of time what they're signing up for and what it's going to be like. And they even make you sign a thing that they lovingly call the death waiver. Basically saying, if something bad happens, you can't sue us because you knew what you were getting into before you came and joined and got all dirty. And I remember the first time that I was going through this, I ran it completely solo, but you get released into the course in packs, and it takes you anywhere from 3 to like 6 hours to get through this entire thing. And you come out the other side bruised and bloody and filthy and sore and painful and hopefully triumphant because you did it, right? And I remember in the wave of people that I was released, we started off and everything was easy and you got like a 1 or 2 mile jog, and then all of a sudden you hit the first wall and you're like, oh shoot, this is why I was doing all those pull-ups, and you got to get up and over. 4 hours later, when you're still doing all that and you're still trying to get through obstacle after obstacle, there are times when we had people that just wanted to give up, where people were hurt. They said, I can't do this anymore. And I can't count how many times I sat there and I would actually go to one of the people next to me and I would like put my hands on the side of the head and say, bro, you signed up for this. You knew what this was going to be. We knew this ahead of time. And I know that that does not make it easy in the right now time, because we still have to get over that wall. You still have like 200 yards of mud with barbed wire over the top that you have to go through, and you're going to get sliced up and it's going to hurt. But remember what we signed up for, that there's a finish line waiting for us. And there's going to be rewards. They've got chocolate milk and other kind of drinks that we don't partake of that's going to be there at the other side of the finish line. And it's going to be okay. So we know that a couple miles later, there's another obstacle. We'll get ready for that one. But this is what we're here for. This is literally what we were. And they're like, okay, I can do this. And so, we get up, we link arms, and we plow right through it. And at the end, we're like, okay, we're going to be all right. Sometimes when that reality came crashing in and our expectation was completely blown away, it could feel really, really overwhelming. And it was only when we stopped and literally linked arms with others that we zoomed out and said, okay, let's remind ourselves why we're here. There's another idea that kind of deals with this, another way of representing this, of how we deal with the disappointment and how we have to keep enduring to the end. John, if you wouldn't pull up one more for me, please. Pull up the next one. This idea that sometimes we think our expectations of life are this straight linear path. And as the change that we see is going to be constant, and it's going to be, a wonderful, wonderful, positive change over time. But when we actually go through our reality and it falls far short of that expectation, that gap between our expectations and the reality, some folks call it the valley of disappointment, right? And I'm sure we've all been there. That's where we find ourselves wanting to stop and to quit and to say, I can't do this anymore, right? But if we look at it from this, sideways far out perspective, we can see that reality can have an exponential curve, and there is a breakthrough point if you keep going. And it may not come as in the time that we wanted, but the beauty of it is that once you hit that breakthrough and you make it to the other side, and once you actually get to a point in your life where it's far above your expectations, I mean, that's God's grace pulling us through. That's the Alma the Younger saying, aha, now I finally get it. And that's the glorious redemption. I think that's the power of the atonement that's helping us get there.
Awesome.
Jenny, any thoughts before we go any further?
I love that. I think that's great. We have the visuals that you add to your descriptions.
I'm so glad. We have this quote from Sister Linda S. Reeves. This is from a talk that was given several years ago called Claim the Blessings of Your Covenants. Jen, could I have you read this selection for me, please?
Of course. The Lord allows us to be tried and tested, sometimes to our maximum capacity. We have seen the lives of loved ones, and maybe our own, figuratively burned to the ground, and have wondered why a loving and caring Heavenly Father would allow such things to happen. But He does not leave us in the ashes. He stands with open arms, eagerly inviting us to come to Him. He is eager to help us, to comfort us, and to ease our pain as we rely on the power of the atonement and honor our covenants. The trials and tribulation that we experience may be the very things that guide us to come unto Him and cling to our covenants, so that we might return to His presence and receive all that the Father hath.
What Sister Reeves says here, I think really ties in well with everything that we've been describing here about keeping going, especially when things are hard. And that's the only way that we hit that breakthrough point, is if we understand the why behind the what, right? It's really easy to get kind of bogged down as we're looking at what we have to do on just the day-to-day. That's the natural man perspective. But if we see with that celestial eye, that why behind it all, then we can keep going. Final verses that we want to share with you today here is in D&C 58, 26 through 29. These are some of my absolute favorite verses and favorite admonitions in the Doctrine and Covenants. Jen, could I ask you to read one last one? I promise this will be the last one for the day.
My pleasure. For behold, it is not meet that I should command in all things. For he that is compelled in all things, the same is a slothful and not a wise servant. Wherefore he receiveth no reward. Verily I say, men should be anxiously engaged in a good cause, and do many things of their own free will, and bring to pass much righteousness. For the power is in them, wherein they are agents unto themselves, and inasmuch as men do good, they shall in no wise lose their reward. But he that doeth not anything until he is commanded, and receiveth a commandment with doubtful heart, and keepeth it with slothfulness, the same is damned.
Boy, man, we could spend a whole second hour just picking this one apart, but there's a lot to talk about here. When it says anxiously engaged, I think it's worth clarifying that we're not talking anxiety like we experience it in 2021, right?
Right. And I love words, and I love finding the exact right definition. I love brevity, not just being brief, but also being accurate. And when it comes to anxious, if you just look up a synonym for it, yes, of course, when we think of anxiety now, we think of being worried, of being fearful, even apprehensive. But anxious can also mean, it can mean desirous. It can mean eager. I think it's worth noting it can mean impatient. Because often we will take anxious to mean a different version of excited, which it also is. You know, it can be eager, it can be desirous, but impatience can be in there too. So I think that's something to think about as well.
Absolutely. You know, I've seen people, I think this is a verse that can, for better or for worse, can trigger a lot of motion in the church. This has been the verse that a lot of ward councils have said, we need to be doing stuff because I'm supposed to be anxiously engaged. And therefore, if I'm not anxiously engaged, I'm going to be damned. So I better be doing something. So what are we doing? Because we've got to be doing something. And the danger with that is we can start to mistake motion for progress. And we can start to mistake busyness for discipleship. And we start creating sort of spiritual hamster wheels with the programs and the policies of the church, where we find ourselves, everybody being busy. And we think that Zion then is this huge city where everybody is always busy all the time and everybody's working on something. And if you don't have something that you're working on, if you ain't hustling, then what you doing? And everybody's supposed to have a hustle. And, you know, this one person is doing family history indexing, and that person is getting all their young womanhood recognitions, and that guy's getting all his Scout Mirror badges, and this guy's getting ready for mission prep. Every single minute of every single day, you've got something going on because I'm anxiously engaged. And if I'm not engaged, then I'm not good enough. And if I'm not good enough, then I'm a poor disciple. And God's like, yo, time out, flip the circuit breaker. That is not what we're talking about here. I like how you said that anxious can mean a lot of different things. The definition here, anxious can mean being careful because you're genuinely worried about the outcome, right? Anxious can mean that you want things to turn out the right way, but you're also willing to let it happen at the natural speed. I think one of the best things that I love about this verse is it says they already have the power in and of themselves. They can already be agents. And so this verse was given specifically to the saints in the era before the Relief Society, before young men, young women, before missionary prep, before Come Follow Me. God is not introducing new programs to them. He is reinforcing his confidence in us that we can do things on our own. And he says like, hey, cool. Go ahead and do whatever you want, whatever excites you, whatever personally engages you to any degree, because your relationship with me is vertical. It's between me and you, and find something that will engage you with God. And if other people around you are also engaged with God in whatever level they're at, awesome. Let's respect their autonomy. Let's respect their agency, and it's going to be okay. And when you let that happen, and when you lower your expectations, then the happiness goes up, and we realize that, wow, I'm now starting to see things from God's perspective. Two ideas that I've seen happen over the past couple of years. One of them, there was a handful of nerds out here in San Jose that were trying to find a way to organize people for a service project. And because there was folks that were wanting to help out, but they didn't know if there was some big master list of service projects that they could just go sign up for. So they slapped together a website, put it on a database, and chucked it out there on the web server. They didn't ask for stake president's permission. They showed up at church one day. They're like, hey, I put together a registration form. Anybody who wants to can go do this. Yada, 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 Just Serve was born. And the church said, dude, that was awesome. And they totally enveloped it. A second one that I heard about, if I can brag on my co-host here for a little bit, past couple of years, there have been these cool things. I forgot the official term, but there was these really awesome donation boxes planted at several places around Utah, usually around the holidays. Places where people could go and you could put cash in and get a receipt out. And that cash would then be used for life-changing investments for people in developing countries, usually around the world. It could be something like for goats or chickens or livestock or supplies or books or school supplies or whatever. And it was a way of bridging time and space, and for people that had some to give to those who had none. And if there was no way to do that. And listeners and participants, I don't know if you knew about this, but our very own Jenny Noonan Dye had this idea of saying, hey, if anybody wants to send me cash, I will go over and I will stand at these machines for as long as it takes, and I will put your cash into these, and I will help you day after day, week after week, make these donations and give them to other people. And I remember listening to that on the early days, several years ago, in the Mormon News Report podcast, and I was like, that is so cool. And I was talking to my wife, and I'm like, can we give them money? Because where I live in California, we didn't have any boxes like that. And I wish there was something that I could do to give that. And so I always thought that was really awesome. So cheers to you. Major toast, major props.
Thank you. Thank you. I was not expecting that. You can follow Proxy Giving Machines on Instagram if you like. There haven't been a lot of posts there because there weren't giving machines last year, but hoping that happens again this year with Giving Tuesday. I know we're over time, but I do just want to say something, because what you said really struck something. Ben, you talked about how often when we hear about being anxiously engaged, we are prompted to default to motion. And, we got to get up, we got to do. And I just want to talk about an alternative for a couple of minutes. When on the Sea of Galilee, when the Savior and his apostles were there, and the Savior was asleep and there was a storm, they were afraid, and they woke up the Savior, who calmed the waters, and he said, peace, be still. And I know that the result of that was that the storm ceased. But the next thing he does is he turns to his disciples, he turns to his apostles and says, why were you afraid? And to me, when he said, be still, I don't think he was just talking to the weather. And if we think about different ways to be anxiously engaged, it doesn't always involve motion. Anxiously engaged in general conference is sitting still and listening, not just to the speakers, but to the Spirit. Anxiously engaged in mourning with those who mourn can be literally sitting down with someone in silence. And so that's something that I felt like I needed to bring up.
Beautiful. There's a quote from a wonderful movie, Dread Pirate Roberts from The Princess Bride. He says simply, sometimes life is about, you have to get used to disappointment. Sometimes it may feel cynical as we lower our expectations, but the reality is that reality is often unkind. And especially in this hyper-connected, overly filtered world, sometimes it's always going to be that way. And as we're going through our figurative migration to Zion, where we show up and we find empty fields instead of planted farms, we find rustic campfires instead of the kingdom of God. Sometimes we have to learn how to be still and figure out, what does this mean? Final stories, we'll wrap it up here. I read years ago an apocryphal account of an early Christian, proto-Christian scriptural book called The Gospel of Adam and Eve. It's no longer included in our Bible, but some, I think Coptics in Egypt believe that this was part of their truth. It tells the story of the first day outside the Garden of Eden and what that was like for Adam and Eve to sit there and be like, all right, he's going to open up any day now, right? And it says that they slept literally outside the gates, and there was the gate behind them. They were trying to get back in, and they knew that right on the other side of the door was their Father and his presence and his glory and immortality. And there was food and there was shelter, and they were locked out. And they thought that any day he's going to open it up again. And so they waited day by day. And now they experienced their first ever sunburn when the sun came up. And now they experienced their first ever dehydration, and now their first hunger pain, and now their first realization that God was not going to open the door, that they were truly, utterly alone. And so after the screams and the cries and the agonizing reality of what this reality was going to ask of them, after all that set in, they, like us, squared up their shoulders, wiped away their tears, and stepped forward into that lone and dreary world to figure out just how in the world they were going to do this on their own. And I think that is when the true test of agency really began. Like was said in that verse, they already had the power inside them, but they had to be put in a place where they could use that power. And so it will be with us. Now we have to find our own good causes. We have to find our own many things to bring to pass. And if we listen carefully, if we are still enough, we can tap into that power that is inside us, that has always been there to bring forth that righteousness. And that's when we will realize that Zion is not a place that God creates and we move in, but it is a state of being that we build right where we are, brick by brick, day by sweltering day.
Okay. Thank you, Ben. Thank you for that lesson, for the thoughts. Thanks to everyone who joined us today, whether you spoke up in the comments or not. Thank you to John Dye for bringing up everything on the screen that we need. Actually, yeah, next week's lesson is going to be called All Flesh is in Mine Hand. It covers Doctrine and Covenants sections 60 through 62. And that will be, again, next week, Sunday, June 6th, around 9 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time-ish. We start between 9 and 9:20 and all times all around the clock. Thank you again to everyone who joined us. Have a great week, and we will talk to you again soon.